It was close to midnight, and a loving Iraqi mother was preparing her two young children for a late-night departure to the airport. This was going to be a one-way trip. They were going to catch a flight to Istanbul, Turkey, to be reunited with this woman's husband and the children's father. He had left weeks prior after being marked for assassination. He had been a contractor for the U.S. military, and someone wanted him and the entire family dead. The mother anticipated that this trip was going to be a dangerous one, so she told her children that if she gave the command, they should get down on the floor and take cover. As they were approaching the airport, just outside the gates, sure enough, she started to hear bullets fire. She told them to get down, and she covered their bodies with hers, and it was life or death. Fortunately, their cab driver turned around, got them to safety quickly. But during their second attempt to get to the airport, they again were deterred by gunfire. Fortunately, on their third attempt, they were successful. They made it to Istanbul, and their family was reunited. They would then live there for the next 3 years in a refugee camp. They began applying for refugee status and resettlement, and they were ultimately granted that resettlement in Houston, Texas. This woman, I heard her speak 2 years ago at World Refugee Day. Her name's Asinja, and when she came to the United States, she did not know English, but she studied very hard, and eventually she was able to become a case manager, helping other refugees who followed in her footsteps. When she was giving her presentation on World Refugee Day, she was also just a few semesters away from becoming a petroleum engineer. During her presentation, she said, "I am a strong and passionate woman. I will always be determined, have faith, and help others." I was inspired by her presentation, but it was also a reminder that her story is representative of the many thousands of refugees who come to our country every year. Collectively, their experiences, their cultures, form a mosaic that enriches all of our lives. In 2012, I was in a time of transition. I was going from the third year of medical school to graduate school, and I also had started volunteering with refugees as an Albert Schweitzer Fellow. This fellowship in Houston supports students like me wanting to do a big idea project in the community. I was going to work with refugees for a year to try to improve their health and well-being. Many people are surprised to learn that Houston is a major refugee resettlement city. Last year, Texas welcomed nearly 9,000 new refugees, and 2,300 of those came to Houston. This makes Houston the U.S.'s largest refugee resettlement city. We, to date, have over 70,000 refugees from nearly 80 different countries, but a majority of our refugees come from Burma, Syria, Iraq, and the Congo. I had no idea before starting my project that I lived in such a rich, diverse, multinational city. Well, what is a refugee? The United Nations High Commission for Refugees defines them as a person who has been forced to flee his or her country because of war, persecution, or violence. In June of this year, the UNHCR announced that there are today over 65 million forcibly displaced people in our world, and over 16 million of those are refugees. Well, where do they go when they leave their homes forever? They end up at places like this, a refugee camp in Nepal, a refuge for people from Bhutan, or they end up in places like this, a tent city in Iraq that is a refuge for people leaving Syria. This is the largest Syrian refugee camp, originally built to house 2,000 people, but as you are aware, there's a crisis in Syria. This tent city now houses over 20,000 people. Just imagine for a moment, look at that picture. Think of you or your family living there for years, feeding on rations, not being able to work, seeing your children's education put on hold. And it's not too hard to imagine then, while people in these kind of camps would make even further risks to try to get to Europe or places where they can resume their lives. To make it even more complicated, less than 1% of people in camps like these will ultimately be granted a legal resettlement somewhere else in the world. Less than 1%. The United States admitted 85,000 refugees last year. That represents less than 0.1% of the world's refugee population. So if anyone tells you we're letting in way too many, keep that in mind. Less than 0.1% of the world's refugees legally resettle to the United States. Once a family has been granted resettlement in the United States, the State Department then looks for a city that already has many refugees from that person's country. Then they look for a resettlement agency within that city that can handle the case. This is where my agency, the Alliance, fits in. The Alliance works with newly arrived refugee clients, and they handle everything. They find their first apartment, they situate it with furniture and food, and they pick them up from the airport to restart their life in the United States. My observation was that many refugees see resettlement here as a panacea. They've lived in refugee camps for years. They've heard about us in the land of opportunity, and they think everything is going to drastically get better the minute they step off that plane. The reality, though, is that resettlement is complicated and it's hard. Besides language and culture, the support that refugees receive when they get here is pretty limited. In Texas, refugees only get 3 months of financial assistance. That's $925 per person per month. And they only get 8 months of coverage under the Refugee Medicaid program. There are other grants and cash assistance programs that refugees can apply for, but they're contingent on that person being in English classes and actively looking for a job. The urgency to get a job is immense, and a lot of times refugees have to take maybe the first offer they get, which means that people who were formerly doctors and lawyers and engineers in their home countries work in very hard labor, low-wage jobs in the United States, at least for a time. Refugee families are eligible for food stamps in Texas, but even that benefit is limited, $650 for a family of 4 per month. So as you can imagine, applying for these things, the social services and the health benefits, requires a lot of forms. And because those are all printed in English, the refugee or family is very dependent on their case manager to help fill those things out. It slows the process down, and it's a big challenge for someone learning English for the first time. About 8 to 10 months after arriving, refugees are essentially expected to be financially independent and self-sustaining. A lot of newly arrived people find this high bar a really difficult task. They came here expecting everything to be better, and then they kind of get down into a slump. Some of them fall into depression, and many fall through the cracks of our healthcare system. My goal of my project was to help improve the health awareness in some way of refugees in Houston. But I realized to do that well, I first needed to see the situation from their eyes. So I sat in on a newly arrived refugee orientation at my agency. I remember there was a family from the Congo and another from Iraq. The teacher had so much material to cover, and the slides were just a hodgepodge of topics. One slide was about public transportation, another one was about voting, and then there was just one slide on healthcare. And I thought, how could you possibly expect someone new to this country, new to this system, to grasp the complexity of that system and use it effectively from one slide? And I was looking at these families' faces and seeing how overwhelmed they were, and I thought, that tells me a lot. The other thing that I did was I held focus groups with people from 5 different countries. And in our conversations, I sought to learn more about the challenges they faced and the things they wanted to learn more about. They told me that for the people who had been here longer than 8 months, many no longer had health coverage, despite the fact that Houston has a really great county medical system. They simply didn't know how to apply for it. Men and women wanted to learn about health screenings that were appropriate for their age. Women wanted to learn about family planning, and all groups were very interested in learning more about mental health, especially depression. This became the starting point for my work. Over the ensuing 9 months, I worked really hard to host Saturday classes. These were hosted at the apartments where the refugees lived, and we covered the topics that they had indicated wanting to know more about. But I learned to be flexible because you never knew what kind of questions people would ask. And case in point, it was not uncommon for a refugee to bring in a medical bill that they wanted some help understanding. I remember looking at a bill with one lady for thousands of dollars, and I was scratching my head, why did this happen? And what really happens is that when someone gets sick and they don't have a car, they just go to the nearest urgent care or freestanding emergency center that's across the street, because that's convenient. They go there, and it ends up being out of network, and they end up with a bill for thousands of dollars that they can never possibly pay. And I saw in the faces of my clients how confusing that was, because they had been told that they had 8 months of health coverage, and not understanding our system, they didn't know why those benefits didn't apply everywhere. Just think how complicated it is for a lot of you in the audience who have health insurance to find a physician who meets your needs, who's in network, and then throw in barriers of transportation, language, and culture. It is a huge barrier. Another observation I had was that many of my clients couldn't interact with the health system because they couldn't read the documents they were receiving. I recall a home visit with a Congolese mother. She was the sole caretaker for 2 young children, and she had chronically uncontrolled high blood pressure. She said sometimes she would get so faint and dizzy she'd pass out, but she was just waiting on health coverage to be approved from the county, and then she would see a physician. I asked her to show me the form she had been receiving, and within a carefully organized stack of letters, there was a letter right there that said, "You've been approved for health benefits." She didn't know what that letter said because she couldn't read it. She also didn't know she had been approved because people in our county refer to coverage as having a gold card. Turns out that the county used to send people a gold-colored card, and that indicated coverage. But years ago, they phased out that terminology and that card in the place of a form letter to explain fee reductions. That is super confusing for someone expecting a gold card to arrive in the mail. But as I saw that case over and over again, I began to wonder, sometimes skeptically, if that was by design. Abraham was one of the friends that I met during my fellowship year. He's the man on the far left side of this slide. He himself is a Bhutanese refugee. He's been here for over 10 years, and he was my go-to guy for teaching my Bhutanese classes on Saturdays. As we were doing those classes, it sometimes felt like we were spinning our wheels. We could only help a small number of people, like some of the people you see in this picture, because everything that was said had to be interpreted and translated twice, from us to them and back. So I thought, is there a way to get more mileage out of this? And then it clicked one day. What if we made videos that explained the class concepts and then translated them to other languages, put them on the internet, and then people could help themselves, or caseworkers could help them? Abraham thought this was a great idea, and he was happy to help. So he invited me over to his home for dinner, and it was so special to get to step into someone else's culture through food and fellowship of spicy peppers, chicken, and rice. And then we did the work of sitting down to translate my video. I thought it would probably take a couple of hours. It ended up taking double that. But that's because Abraham was insistent we record and re-record every line until it was absolutely perfect. Like me, he knew that people from his country could use every leg up we could offer, and he was determined to make this tool perfect so it would help people for years to come. In that moment, and seeing his determination, I realized just how bright of a future there was ahead for many of the people that I had been helping that year. Working on this project taught me many important lessons, and I'd like to leave you with 3 of them. The first is, refugees are some of the most courageous and resilient people I have ever met in my life. It is very disingenuous to say that they have malice toward our country or that they have it easy, because they certainly don't. Refugees, in my experience, leave their country under threat of death sometimes. They live in squalid refugee camps for years. And the ones that get to come to the United States are incredibly grateful to be here. The second observation I had is that when you find a passion like this one, you should really throw yourself into it and be open to the unexpected twists and turns that it might take. I would encourage all of you, if you can, to volunteer in some way with refugees, because no matter where you live, there's a good chance there are some refugees in your neighborhood. And if all you do is advocate for their cause from hearing this speech, that in itself will be a huge help, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about them. I was open to the twists and turns that my project took. I was underprepared at first, but with time, I learned to lead. I learned to fundraise and inspire others around a common cause. And then in a really special twist toward the end, I met my life partner, a woman who was just as passionate about this cause as me. When I think about my very first focus group with people from Burma, it was a sunny Saturday in the fall, and we were sitting in this classroom. It was mostly empty, with 15 men and women who had come hoping I could help them. As I learned about the barriers facing them, I wondered if I was biting off more than I could chew. But just 9 months later, we were in that very same classroom, and the room was packed. We were all sitting underneath the American flag. There were lots of refugee clients. We had medical students, physicians, interpreters. Our collective volunteer force had grown immensely over the course of the year. And I saw how this project had literally taken on a life of its own and grown organically. And I'm happy to report that elements of it continue even to this day. So that taught me the third take-home lesson from this, which is that it is a really great idea to find some outlet for service in your life as a student or a working professional, and to make it part of who you are. I would encourage all of you to throw yourself into those pursuits with a passion and be open to the change that it might inevitably bring to your life, because it most certainly will. Thank you.